إن الحمد لله الصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum. May peace, mercy and blessings of God be with all of you. Zakat is considered one of the pillars of Islam and is an important financial obligation on Muslims given certain conditions. Today, inshallah, let's take a brief look at some of these conditions as understood in the Hanafi school of thought. Zakat is not charity in general. Charity in itself is highly encouraged in Islam, both financial and non-financial, as a means for getting closer to God and for helping those less fortunate around us. But zakat is a specific form of worship, and like other such formal acts, take salat or namaz as an example, zakat also is governed by some very specific guidelines and rules. These are mentioned in the Quran itself and also in the authentic sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So, some things that generally we consider when giving general charity or sadaqah, such as someone being a widow or someone being an orphan, in themselves may not be sufficient criteria for someone accepting zakat. Now, in classical scholarship, zakat is defined as a certain rate of poor due that has to be paid on savings of a certain kind once they reach a certain level over a certain period of time and given to people who fulfill certain criteria. Let's look at these one by one now. The rate of zakat is relatively well known and is 2.5% or the 40th part of your savings given the criteria. The level to which the savings have to reach is called the nisab. This is defined as the value for 7.5 dollars of gold or 52.5 dollars of pure silver. Historically, these two values have not diverged as much as they do today since the price of gold shot up a few years ago. Today, scholars generally advise following the nisab as defined by the price of 52.5 dollars of silver as a precaution and ihtiyat. This value today comes to about 42,000 rupees in Pakistan. The duration that I mentioned is 12 months, a lunar calendar. This is about 10 to 12 days less than the Gregorian calendar. And we'll take another look at this with some examples later on. But for now, let's talk about the certain kind of savings that I referred to. If I may coin a couple of new terms here, I would say that your savings can be divided into two categories: the zakatable savings and the non-zakatable savings. You have to pay zakat only on your zakatable savings once the other criteria is also fulfilled. What is it that constitutes zakatable savings? First of all, gold, silver. These two precious metals in any form and shape, if they are in your possession, be it in the form of jewelry or maybe a gold bar locked away somewhere, these would be zakatable wealth. Money, that's the third. And then also investments. And finally, livestock. For the purposes of this discussion, we will not go into too much detail regarding livestock, but let's talk a little more about the investments that I just mentioned. I will be able to share, inshallah, a litmus test with you that you can apply to anything to understand if this in fact should be considered as an investment and therefore as part of the zakatable savings. The litmus test is this: if the item that you are looking at is something that is in your ownership and you intend to eventually sell it for a profit, no matter what you want to do later on with that profit, this item then would be considered an investment and would be a part of your zakatable savings. For example, it could be a diamond ring. If you eventually plan to sell this and get some profit, this is an investment. It could be stocks. If you eventually plan to sell them, this is an investment. It could also be a plot of land, real estate. If the intention, for example, is to hold on to a piece of land for some period of time and eventually sell it for profit, then this is an investment and zakat has to be paid on its value, given other conditions. Take another example. If this is a piece of land that you have bought, you don't intend to sell this, but actually plan perhaps to build a house on this eventually. Then this, when you apply the litmus test that I just described, you will find is actually not an investment. You do not plan to sell this for a profit. The other land which you are selling, imagine that the money, the profit that came from it, you wanted to use to construct a house on this other one. What about this land now that you were selling? You're using that money to build a house. But when you apply the litmus test, you see that because the intention, first of all, is to sell it for a profit, that makes this an investment, and zakat would have to be paid on its value, given other conditions. There is one thing more that has to be kept in mind, and that is debt. Zakat essentially is an obligation from God. And if you are in debt to other people, then the way that the rulings have been put forward, the debt to other people gets preference over this obligation from God. So imagine that you have assets, either individually or altogether zakatable wealth, that adds up to the nisab level and the other conditions are met. Then imagine that this value comes out to be 500,000 rupees. Imagine also that you are in debt to somebody for a value of 600,000. So the net value puts you in a deficit. The net value shows that you are not at the nisab level, and so you would not have to pay zakat. Let's also take a look at the non-zakatable type of savings, just for completeness. Anything which is not in the zakatable kind of saving is then a non-zakatable saving. This could include items of necessity, such as a house, maybe, a motorbike, a car. It could also include other things of use, like a watch, even precious stones. If the litmus test of investment fails, if this jewelry, which is if it's not gold, if it's not silver, if you don't plan to sell it for a profit, let's say it's sapphire, diamond, whatever, then this is in the non-zakatable category. Zakat becomes due on the person who owns the zakatable assets. If it's a partnership, then you take a look at the percentage ownership that you have and the value of that. But take the example of a family. Let's say that there is a wife who has maybe 10 tolas of gold, maybe jewelry, and then zakat becomes due on her. This zakat can also be paid with mutual agreement by her husband on her behalf, and that is fine too. Zakat doesn't have to be paid in one major lump sum payment either. Once you cross the nisab level at the start of a year, then you can actually create some installments for yourself. And at the end of the year, you can revisit your savings and identify whatever balance remains and make that adjustment. That is fine too. Zakat doesn't have to be paid in Ramadan, but that is something that we are more used to in our society, and it's fine. But otherwise, imagine that you go above the zakat nisab level, let's say at the end of Zilhajjah in a year, then essentially you can also pay your zakat before the start of next Zilhajjah. Now, let's move a little forward and talk a little bit about who we can give zakat to. As I said at the start, there are some specific guidelines for this, and the Quran itself addresses this in chapter number 9, verse 60, where it lays out 8 uses for zakat. So for instance, it talks about giving zakat to the poor, the needy, to pay ransom for those held captive, to pay off the debts of people, to spend in the way of God, to spend to help the wayfarer or the traveler, and also to pay the salaries of officials who are managing this system. In essence, today, this means that you can pay zakat to someone who himself or herself does not have zakatable wealth reaching up to the nisab level. the condition of 12 months that I talked about, that doesn't apply on recipients. As soon as they get money of the zakatable kind that reaches up to the nisab level, now they cannot accept zakat. Take the example of wealth of the non-zakatable kind. If someone has savings of the non-zakatable kind reaching up to the nisab level, zakat will still not become due because this is non-zakatable wealth. But what it will do is that if then these savings have not been in this person's use for the last lunar year, then he cannot be a recipient of zakat. If they have been in his or her use, then this person can still accept zakat. It is generally said that giving zakat to those closest to us is great, is best. Charity, after all, begins at home. What a wonderful principle. But there are some things to keep in mind here. We cannot give zakat to those directly above or below us in lineage. So, for example, giving zakat to one's father or mother or grandparents is not fine. Similarly, giving it to one's children or their children is also not allowed. Zakat has to be paid to someone and it has to be given into their ownership so that they can then use it of their own free will. This means that otherwise very noble projects like building a hospital, an educational institute, a masjid, a water supply, these may not be valid uses for zakat money. Once you've given zakat to somebody who fulfills the other criteria and then they use it to do one of these things or anything else, that then is just fine. Accepting zakat shouldn't be taboo. Zakat is a process obligated by God and it can only be completed when somebody is accepting zakat. But in our society, sometimes it is frowned upon. So, what does it mean? It means that when you're giving zakat to someone, you don't necessarily have to tell them that this is zakat money. Once you've done your own assessment that they can be recipients of zakat. Why? Because telling them this would hurt their self-esteem, and that is definitely not desired. In the end, there are two other topics of interest related to zakat that I would briefly touch upon. Sometimes people ask if zakat is the same as tax, and if you've already paid tax, do you still have to pay zakat? We spoke about chapter 9, verse 60 of the Quran just a while ago, and you saw that zakat has to be spent on some very specific uses. Earlier, we have also seen that it can be collected in some very specific circumstances as well. So this clearly shows that a modern state to function has to collect money other than zakat to be able to spend on places other than those laid out in these guidelines. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to function. This tells us that zakat and taxation, these are two separate things. And so, even if you've paid your taxes, zakat is a separate obligation from God that has to be paid. Also, is zakat due on your rent? Let's say if you have some rental income coming in, or your salary on a monthly basis. As we've seen earlier in this discussion, zakat becomes due on your savings. And therefore, if you are getting a rental income or a salary, no matter what the amount, and it gets spent out, doesn't get added to your savings, doesn't, in that way become a part of your zakatable wealth, then zakat is not due on it. Let's in the end also look at a quick example to understand how some of this works. Imagine that we are using a Ramadan to Ramadan calendar, and at the end of one Ramadan, you are above the nisab level, you have 100,000 rupees. Then imagine that just before the start of the next Ramadan, you receive another 50,000 rupees. So now, the way to calculate your zakat would be that when this Ramadan comes, the second one, you see that 12 months ago, you were above the nisab level, you were at 100,000, but now At the end of the 12-month period, you are at 150,000. So zakat will be paid on this final value. That's how you would calculate the money that you have to pay. That basically is everything that I wanted to talk about. Thank you so much for your time, and I pray to God that this discussion is of some use to you. Thank you very much once again. وآخر الدعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.